Welcome to our next segment in Basar B'Chalav, continuing in Siman Pei Zayin, chapter 87. We are in the middle of Sif Vav, and we're going to finish up Vav, Zayin, and Ches in this class. There's a lot to cover, word-wise, in the Mechaber and the Ramah, but the actual sources of these things are not as deeply divided as what we had learned in our previous class regarding Mei Chalav, and regarding whey, or what is considered the permitted extract of milk and cheese to be that isn't really considered milk. So we're going to continue in the Ramah. So after bringing forth his opinion about Mei Chalav in Vav, in which he says that we consider whey to be prohibited by Torah law as considered milk, the Ramah continues with a number of stringencies to avoid when coming together to cook different items. So he quotes the first rule. He says, there are those who say, Yesh Omrim, that one should not stoke the fire beneath the pot that belongs to a goy. Okay? Why? Because in those pots they cook together flavors that are sometimes milk and sometimes meat. And one who stokes the fire underneath their pots is going to be cooking Basar B'Chalav. Okay? Now before you get really angry and start saying this sounds like a big chumrah, just wait until we finish this and then we'll explain it. There are those who also write that one should not mix together waters that were used for the cleaning of meat dishes with water that was used for the cleaning of dairy dishes, and to put them before an animal to drink. Okay? So you are trying to conserve some water, and you're going to mix the water you use for washing those dishes. Why should you not do that? Because they are prohibited from benefit, as I said. Okay. The next thing he quotes is that the utensil that you use for making shampoo. Okay, they used to cook up a little concoction back in the day to wash your hair. One should not mix it using the ash that came from beneath the stove. Okay. So, I'm sorry. It's that one should not use it for regular cooking. Because you are going to be you use this pot to make your hair shampoo from the ash that comes from under the stove, and often what gets mixed under there is some of the meat and some of the milk. Okay, so he's saying that when you cook on the coals, meat and milk get mixed down there. If you take from that ash, try to cook with it, that's a problem. He doesn't have a problem with you using it, right? So he says further, and therefore one should also prohibit using those pots that are the pots that are used on the winter stove. So just to explain what the winter stove is, the winter stove was a separate stove in the part of the house where it was stoked with large logs of fire, and it would basically have a large pot filled with water on it to steam heat the house. And you kept that going. You kept it filled with water and boiling so that the house was filled with heat. But you did not use it for regular cooking. So he says, that's why you should not use the pot on top of it, because sometimes sprinklings from meat and milk will get there. Okay? From the pots that you are cooking in the ovens. All right, so even though it's technically a separate thing, sometimes stuff sprays on it. You shouldn't use it. However, the Ramah concludes Sif Vav by saying, and after the fact, one should not be concerned for those things, and even before the fact, meaning if you wanted to use it, there's not really these are only stringencies and not something to be worried about. And one who chooses to be lenient is not violating anything. So let's go over these little stringencies a little bit, just kind of understand what's going on with them, and then we'll work on finishing the rest of this of these two halachas that we've been working on regarding different parts of the animal that are not part of basar b'chalav. Okay. So the first thing is that we said we should not mix the water that is used for rinsing meat and dairy dishes together in order to give them to your animal to drink. Okay? So what are we talking about over here? So the shach says that the prohibition bahana, right? The prohibition to benefit from it is when you wash these dishes in boiling water and they're still boiling and got mixed together. Okay? And without that, then there's no isser hana. That would make sense, because if they were cold, there wouldn't be any cooking. So that's what the shach suggests the Ramah was talking about. So the stringency was only to take boiling hot water that we were washing dishes in and then mixing them together in order to give them to your animal. Rabbi Akiva Eger has a different approach. So why does he have to say that there's a prohibition of hana? So you should also say that mixing it would be a problem because I'm cooking them, right? There's an isser to cook. So he says I don't see that as being the case. The Minchas Yaakov suggests makes a different suggestion that it's actually cold water, and one should not do that together by mixing basar b'chalav together at all. Just something interesting that technically could be a problem here is that the milk and the meat are also not barnat. So meaning, which we'll learn about later on, they're not full-fledged flavors going into the water, and there seems to be a stringency together for them. So everyone seems to agree that this is really just a stringency. We're trying to figure out what that stringency would be. So that's why the shach says it can only be when everything's hot, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense, which actually makes the most sense. But the Minchas Yaakov's answer is also basically to say that because of the prohibition on benefit, we therefore are creating a stringency to avoid this possibility. And that's also possible. And that seems to be how many people would conduct themselves. So when we said that we were using some of the ash from under the stove and this is a coal-fired stove, to go ahead and make a shampoo out of it to clean one's head. So what's going on over here is that the pot that you're using for washing your head, you can't use it to cook food in it, okay? And you also can't heat up water for drinking, because sometimes you're going to have the meat and milk underneath it cooking together, and that's a basar b'chalav problem, okay? And when you take from the ash that's underneath this stove to use it for a head scrub or a shampoo, so that's the problem, is that the basar b'chalav might be under there, and therefore it's going to prohibit the pot itself. So the shach asks an obvious question. So why am I allowed to scrub my head with it if that's the problem? Why am I only saying I can't eat it? So rinsing your head or washing your head is not an act of consumption. You're not eating anything, and therefore not considered part of benefit, because you don't actually benefit from the isser itself. Okay? And this is something we will learn on later on in Siman Sadi Dalet about what benefit actually means. So this gets further discussed in the Sefer Kresi Uplesi about if you can use shampoo that's made from basar b'chalav. That's what the shach seems to imply. And what he says over there is that there's a difference between consuming as a result of having cooked something, and consuming as resultant from cooking. So when you eat something, the Basar B'chalav prohibition is when the Basar B'chalav itself is, even when it's not implying it has to impart a good flavor. Okay, so and in this case, we saw this earlier, by the way, that we talked about this earlier, because we don't see Basar B'chalav mention achila, so therefore we say that Basar B'chalav has to be something that is something that has to be has to have some type of benefit that you would consume. Okay. Okay. But this is if the Basar B'chalav is not ruined after the cooking. Okay, as a result of this cooking, this case, that Basar B'chalav would go away, and he wouldn't have a problem with it. So that's why, in this case, using it as a shampoo would not be a problem, because when you're using it mixed with ash, it's going to be something that is not possible to be consumed. Okay, and so the mixing of the milk and the meat in the ash underneath this stove is not going to become Basar B'chalav. That's why, again, it becomes only a stringency. And so when the Ramah ends this by saying, hey, this is only stringencies, right? So the Pri Megadim asks on this guy, saying, why are these only chumras? So you're constantly cooking more Basar B'chalav one after the other, and that should be a problem. And we mentioned this by saying earlier in a previous year that what's called bishul achar bishul on Shabbos could apply to Basar B'chalav as well. So he suggests that this is not a normal manner of cooking, and therefore was not prohibited by the Torah. Okay? Because we're only concerned about when something comes directly into the pot and out of the pot into the food. That's where the issue lies. Okay? So he says also that if I were to take and cook meat in a milk pot, okay, so that is where the actual prohibition would be. Meaning, I cooked, let's say, a cream in my pot this morning, and then in the afternoon I take meat and I cook it in that pot. The Torah prohibits that form of cooking. But in this case, where the meat and the milk are mixing with the other stuff or whatever, or some of these flavors are sticking around later in the pot, that's why they're only astringency. Now, let's move on to some of the interesting stuff over here mentioned in Zion and Ches. So in Zion, the interesting thing over here is we're talking about other parts of the animal and whether or not they are included in the prohibition of Basar B'chalav. So the first item is the shalil. Okay, so we're talking about part of that's only in the cow. There's parts of it known as the shira and the shalia. These are parts of the reproductive system of the animal. And so if you take that part of it, okay, if you take that part of it and cook it with milk, you are violating the Torah prohibition. And eating it also violates the Torah prohibition. But if you take the shalia, okay, which is the uterus, okay, or you take the skin, okay, the entire skin of the animal, and also the gidim and any of the ligaments. Not the ligaments, the tendons, and then the atzamos, which are the bones, and then the ikrei karnayim and tlafim, and then the ends of the horns, and then the hooves. Even if the hooves are soft, the part of the hooves that are soft, that is considered pater. Okay, so you're not violating the Torah prohibition, and eating them is also pater. Okay, so let's talk about this. Is a very straightforward halacha. It comes great from the Gemara. Okay, so why is there between the shir and the shalia, the shil and the shalia? Okay, and these are all parts of the reproductive system. And also part of the excretory system. Why are we lenient on them? Okay, and why they're lenient? Why are some excluded? Why are some included? So some are considered meat and some are not. So the Gemara in Chulin, this is in Kuf Gimel. So Shmuel says that a gedi says that lo shavash al gedi, right? Says a gedi So what's the gedi? The gedi means to include the shalil, right? So we're including that part of the animal. Okay, so we also say it's a little goat, which is to exclude the blood. Okay, so we didn't mention that in halacha, but this is in the same statement. And we also say to exclude the shalia. Okay, so that's the first statement. Then the Gemara brings up a problem with that on the next page in Kuf Yud Daled, and says, 1 second. If you cook the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves, that's putter. Okay. So what's the deal with the shalil and the shalia? So, okay. So what's the shalil? So the shalil is basically the uterine sac, and he says Rashi explains over there that is the only time that's really going to be pertinent is when you have a living animal still attached to it. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. The shalia is the uterine sac. The shalil is the placenta, and so that's what he says. So and then one is considered really gross, and people wouldn't eat it, and the other one is still considered part of the animal, and therefore considered meat. Okay. So. One of the things to think about is, what includes something, what excludes something. So if we answer that something is kind of nasty, people wouldn't really eat it. That doesn't mean it shouldn't still be prohibited by cooking, but it still should be considered something to be prohibited at least for cooking. And even if you don't personally want to eat it, it is edible. So many people just sort of say, well, that maybe by benefiting, it could be permitted. So that's something else. Something else that's interesting is there's a actually machlokes Rashi and Tosafos in another Gemara elsewhere about if the testes are considered prohibited or not, and so it's also machlokes. So that's what we see over here is that there's a difference between the two things. So the placenta is kind of gross; we won't eat it. Okay, so therefore it's not prohibited. And so, but the shalil, which is the uterus, it's going to be prohibited because it's part of the animal, considered meat. So we mentioned that the hooves are soft in the mechaber. So where does that come from in our source material? So the Rambam says the following in quoting this halacha. Okay, so this is the Rambam says that if you cook the shalil, if you cook the uterus with milk, okay, you are violating a Torah prohibition, and so too if you eat them. Okay, but if you take the placenta or the skin or the tendons and the bones and also the hooves, and then he adds the words tlafim harachim. He says the soft hooves. Okay, and so he says that's exempt. Eat them is exempt. Oh, 1 second. He says that. So it sounds like it sounds like there's something that would be putter, but it seems like there's something between soft ones, but firm hooves could be completely permitted. So this is a question the post can take up: is why does the Rambam change slightly from the language of the Gemara in Chulin? So the Pri Megadim points out that when they say it's putter, that means that even bones that are hard are prohibited to cook with milk on a rabbinic level. And that's what the Rambam himself is talking about. Is that why there is certain things that are softer? It's talking about all those things that are soft, but he's not sure because he doesn't have a proof for that. But that's his suggestion that he was including everything in there, meaning that if it was soft, that is a rabbinic prohibition, whereas if they were all hard, it's not even any prohibition. Okay, so that's Pri Megadim was guessing that was actually something that the Rambam had thought about, but other people are going to disagree with that in a second. So there's a Knesset Zekadola seems to agree with that, and he actually says that if everything is firm and hard, Chazal didn't prohibit it at all. And the Prisha and the Shulchan Gavoa, the Minchas Yaakov, all seem to agree with this statement. Okay. So what's interesting about this is that this machlokes actually goes on for centuries. um, and so there's also the Shach makes this point as well on our Siman that by soft bones there actually might be a Torah prohibition because they're close. So he might be referring to not necessarily soft bones, but tissue that's in between the bones that is soft, and that would be a Torah prohibition. Like cartilage might be a different rule. So Yitzchak Abramsky is quoted in the Sefer Sitz Eliezer, and in this case they're talking about gelatin. So he says that it's only for the bones that are soft where the Rambam says that there is a rabbinic prohibition or an implied rabbinic prohibition. He doesn't say it's asr, it says pater. That means pater of asr. Okay. So those seem to be things that would be the kings. And the Achiezer also says something similar like that. So that's something that he points out as a reason to be potentially lenient by certain types of gelatin. The Minchas Yitzchak points out that from the Pri Megadim, that the bones themselves should also be prohibited even when they're hard, because he just takes it as a given. The Igros Moshe seems to side with the idea that gelatin that is made from hides and not from bones would be okay to mix them with milk. So what's interesting is that in these different shuvas of Rav Moshe, he doesn't like the idea of permitting gelatin because he feels it's still a rabbinic prohibition to eat them. But he does take the approach that these would be permitted, that gelatin made from the skins itself, and you extract the collagen from that would be permitted. So let's take a little bit of a dive here into the bones. Let's take a look at this for a second. And here's something to understand. So the bones themselves is a question later on as to whether or not bones are considered part of the permitted material or the prohibited material. Okay. So there's a bunch of there's a bunch of machloks and different opinions in the Rishonim on this issue, and it's a question of if it's a prohibited meat or prohibited animal, which means the meat is prohibited, that includes the bones with them as well. Okay, but maybe the bones don't count towards the prohibited stuff. So there are those who say that it counts towards prohibited. There are those who say it increases the volume and doesn't count towards the prohibited. The very large popular opinion, which is like the Rashba, the Rush, Rabbeinu Shimshon, the Tur, and all these things these sheets are all brought down in Siman Sadi test later on, are basically say that the bones themselves count towards the permitted number, meaning the volume of permitted material, in order to make sure that you get the shishim against the prohibited material. There's another, there's other opinions that are not so clear about that, like the Ran and the Ra'ah, who don't like being so lenient on that. So the Beis Yosef brings down, that there's one more opinion that says that it depends on if the bones are part of an animal where the animal that is the prohibited one is the same type as the animal that's the permitted one. But the point is that the Beis Yosef himself in Sadi Test takes the approach of the lenient opinions, okay? And so therefore it sounds like hard bone, he takes that approach that hard bone is not considered prohibited, okay? The Ramah, however, that without a great financial loss, he is of the opinion that he should not count the bones of the prohibited animal towards the permitted amount, but you could rely on this in a time of great need. Okay, so that's what it sounds like. So from the Mechaber, it sounds like the firm bones are a problem. The Pri Megadim takes note of that, and you know, so that seems like a pretty standard opinion over here. So he takes note of that. The Madnei Shulchan makes an interesting point in our section over here. He says that it seems to be that there's a difference between Basar B'chalav and other prohibitions. By other prohibitions, which is in Sadi Tess, okay, we're talking about taking. So by Basar B'chalav, they're both permitted, and mixing them is prohibited. But by Sadi Tess, you have something that is essentially prohibited mixed with something that we all agree is permitted. So the bones there, whether there's flavor or not, they're not considered a prohibited flavor in the mixture. But the lenient opinions are basically trying to say that they should count towards the permitted sides. Okay, and so, but it's not contributing to the prohibited. And therefore we can look to extract from that whatever little bit of flavor may have come from the bone, assuming that there is any, would probably become buttal in the other flavors of the bones of the permitted stuff. Okay. However, if we're talking about mixing bone with milk, that is different, because you need to really you'll feel that there's a difference between whatever flavor is in the bones getting into the milk, and so therefore one should be more strict in the case of Basar B'chalav. So therefore the idea between hard and soft better, he says you really need to be more concerned about whatever flavor might be in bone getting into that. So that's his sort of statement right there. So even though we see that there's cases where even hard bones could be permitted, he seems to feel that one should actually be more strict by Basar B'chalav in these cases. What happens then if the skin falls into the milk? Okay, so if it's softer, like the uterus that we talked about, those things should be considered more like meat. Okay, but if it's like the skin itself, like that you would turn into leather, that we can definitely be a little more lenient. And what about the tendons? What do we say about those? Okay, so we said that the tendons we were lenient. So so basically they are under a same problem over there. That there's another Gemara elsewhere that talks about them being firm and soft, and so if they are considered soft, then they could feel more like meat, and if they're hard, they could feel more like bone. And Rashi mentions this. Okay. So what's sort of like the final decision over there? So we finally make the decision that tendons don't have any flavor in them, so they're different than bones. So therefore, it won't prohibit milk if it fell in there. And so too, the skin of the animal won't do anything. However, when it comes to those softer types of things, so those things are actually meat, and that's what the Mechaber is pointing out over there. Okay? And so there's a couple of things to mention about this opinion of the Rambam. Let's see. I think we'll skip that note over there. Okay. So let's wrap that up over here with this. And I want to hit Zion real quick, and Zion and Ches also. So the idea is that when you cook these things, even though we say that they're pater, it's still prohibited. Okay, so that means that we should have to take to heart that these things we're not going to be eating them, and they really only seem to have a practical application with a case of like gelatin. Okay, so those things would be the only cases where it would be possible, but there you'd have to use permitted ones and not prohibited ones to go ahead and make gelatin. So let's go over that, and then we'll go through Ches, and then I'm going to bring down all the halachas that we've learned in Hey, Vav, Zayin, and Ches all together for a quick review. Actually, I'll do a separate video from this one that's a quick review. So what we've learned from this Gemara is that for certain parts of the animal that are inedible or people don't like them, it's putter, but there's a rabbinic prohibition against it. Okay, so they're not considered part of the animal if they don't want to be eaten. Okay, so we learned from the Rambam that he mentions a number of things have to be soft for you to violate a rabbinic prohibition, but it sounds like that if it were firm, it would not be a problem. So the Pri Megadim is the first one to really suggests that the language of soft only applied to the hooves, but everything else there should always be a blanket restriction against cooking them with meat and milk. The Knesset Gedola and the Shach seem to say that hard bones are not included in the prohibition of Basar Chalav, even a rabbinic one. And the Shach makes one little difference to say that soft bone should really be a Torah prohibition, but the Knesset Gedola doesn't agree with him on that. Okay, so, and when it comes to the skin of the animal and the tendons, so we were pointing out that there's only a rabbinic prohibition, and there's no reason to prohibit these things. However, we pointed out that there should be a distinction between other types of prohibitions, like if you get it from an avela and a treifa animal, versus a case of basar b'chalav, if these things, the skin and the tendon, fall into milk, okay, you're not allowed to go ahead and cook them together at all. But if you do find flavor in there, you should be strict on it, as we mentioned from the Matnei Shulchan. Okay, and anything else on the animal that's basically soft that could be considered meat, you should definitely prohibit it straight out. Okay, and so therefore that's what we learned. We also talked briefly about gelatin, and we said that since these things, some of them are considered not at all like meat, so if they were kosher, you could make them into gelatin by extracting the collagen from them, and then you could mix them with milk. This would mean that you could have a yogurt made with gelatin that is from a bovine gelatin, for example, and not have to rely on fish gelatin to make it. So if you want to thicken a low-fat yogurt, you can use that. You can use gelatin in there. What other kosher agencies use are things like agar-agar and carrageenan if they don't have easy access or cheap access to kosher gelatin in those situations. Okay, we're going to go over Ches, and then we're going to go over Hey, Vav, Zayin, and Ches all together again. So let's just read Ches over here. Okay, so Ches is kind of a restatement of what we learned at the beginning of Vav in terms of Mei Chalav. And so he says over here, there are those who say that Nisyove de Chalava. Okay, what is Nisyove de Chalava? So this is the milk that comes as a result of standing cheese, and the cheese is beginning to coagulate. So Nisyove de Chalava are not part of Mei Chalav. We talked about that when we talked about what was the liquid from the Chalav. And it is prohibited from the Torah. So the milk that comes from cheese, which we said in our last class, is prohibited. Mei Chalav is after you make the cheese, you cook the whey that comes out of it, and the curds come out of that and float to the top, and the left is just a type of water, and that's Mei Chalav. And that's, in the event that we talked about, the Ramah was strict in those cases as well. So let's go over. Okay, so we'll end this class here, and I'm going to make another class that's going to be a sichum of the halachos from Hey, Vav, and Zayin, since we've discussed them pretty significantly over the past few weeks. Thank you for joining our class. And in the next class that we'll pick up, we're going to discuss Sifim Tes Yud and Yud Aleph. We're going to go through 9, 10, 11, and we're going to talk more about cheese making, and we're going to learn a lot about that, and we'll learn a lot about the kosher status of different types of foods and how we can make them kosher so that they do not violate the prohibition of Basar b'chalav.